Our good or bad debt discussion starts with obviously our financial statement. Now, the first thing to consider is when we talk about debt, what is debt? The focus here is specifically on interest-bearing debt. Looking at our balance sheet, we notice that we have two areas of interest-bearing debt, namely our short-term debt and our long-term debt. And in order to explain how we determine, or at least a methodology in order to determine the difference between good versus bad debt, we move from our financial statements into an environment where it's a little more easier to identify the story of our business, and that is through the one-page financial scorecard. What this shows us is obviously our income statement and our balance sheet, and we connect that to the various areas that reflect our performance and the value that we've created through the different actions and strategies of our business. Our focus here obviously is on debt. So we'll move into our cash flow funding environment, and the first thing we notice is the total of our short-term and long-term debt amounts to $848,000 in the previous period, and in the current period obviously our total debt has increased to over 1.1 million, or if you want to, you could call it 1.1 billion, whichever way you want to look at it. The first principle is there are only two ways in which a business can be funded, any business, and that is through the combination of debt and equity. So the funding base in this business for the current period is sitting at about $1.8 million. And the combination that establishes that $1.8 million is debt of $1.1 million and $705,000 of equity. So the first argument could be in terms of, how do we structure the funding of our business? We notice that in the previous period, for every dollar of equity, we actually have $1.91 of debt. That has declined in the current period to $1.57. So the question then begs as to whether this is a reflection on the fact that this could be good debt. Many organizations deliver a policy in terms of debt in relation to the proportion of debt to equity. And that is possibly one way of resolving the debt to equity position. However, we like to maybe think of this slightly differently. So bearing in mind the combination of our funding of debt to equity produces a funding base of $1.8 million. So if we have a way to compare what the cost is to produce that funding, or to enable us to have that funding, so the cost of having that funding versus the return that those funds deliver in relation to the organization. So now we would have a very clear capability to be able to compare cost versus return. Obviously, if our return on our funds employed in the business is greater than the cost of that debt, we might be in a position to start considering the fact whether we have good or bad debt. So what is the return on the funds that we have in our business? Well, the way we do this is by looking at what we call our measure here being return on capital employed. Now, the return on our capital employed says, okay, how effectively are we using the funds that we have in our business, in the operations of our business? So obviously we have a balanced balance sheet. So as you can see, there are the funds that we have in our business, and now we're going to look at the return on those same funds. So previously our return on those funds, as measured by our earnings before interest and tax divided by those net operating assets, produced a return on our investment, or a return on the invested dollar, of 30 cents per invested dollar, slightly declining to 24 cents per invested dollar. So now we have a position where we can actually compare the return on the total funding base And then what we need to be able to do is compare the cost in relation to that funding base. And the way we do this is very simply look at the average cost of debt. So the average cost of debt, which in essence is basically our total cost of interest divided by the average debt that we have in our organization, or average interest-bearing debt, in this case produces an average cost of debt of about, let's call it 8% or 7.9%. So we have on the one side, in terms of the cost of what we're doing, or the cost of our funding is roughly 8%, yet that same funding base is producing a return of 24 cents per invested dollar. So we have a cost of 8 and a return of 24. So what does that really tell us? That gives us an indication of the degree of what we call leverage. So how are we leveraging the ability to take other people's money and make money from other people's money? So our effectiveness is that basically we're getting about a 3 times capability of leveraging that cost of debt. And usually that's a very nice rule of thumb. So what our rule of thumb is that we're looking for a return on our total capital of about 3 times the average cost of debt. So in this case, we could argue that we have reasonably good debt. Now, if that return on the total funding base was pretty much close to the cost of debt, then you could argue that your policy should be primarily focused towards debt reduction. So now I know there's going to be a whole variety of people that are going to tell us, well, you know something, you haven't taken into account the cost of equity. And I totally and completely agree with you. However, what this does is this provides us with a quick guideline as to how we can look at whether we have good and bad debt. And it is an indicator that has a clear measurement philosophy behind it. What if we went down the road where we actually increased our growth rate, let's say from 23% to 30%, how would that impact the position in relation to whether we had good debt or bad debt? So now let's have a quick look and see. Well, unfortunately, it's very difficult to determine. So what we want to do is we want to quickly go and look at the impact of that strategy on our debt structure. So what this actually tells us is that, in essence, that additional growth rate, so let's quickly go and have a look at that additional growth rate of about 7%, 6.67%, so roughly a 7% additional growth rate. So now we're just looking at the impact of that strategy, shows us that, in essence, additional debt, the additional debt, as shown by our net cash flow, would be about $6,000 worth of additional debt, and yet our return on that improves by about 2 cents per invested dollar. So actually what we can clearly state that, you know, the additional net operating assets that we require is $41,000, providing an additional return of 2%. So therefore, we would be in a position to clearly show that a strategy of growth still provides us with a strong, good debt policy. So using debt to fund that additional growth is a good strategy. Okay, so let's return back to our original, turn to the position that we can notice after we've increased our revenue. What we've noticed is that this provides us at least with a guideline. And I totally agree with you. Yes, we've got to go maybe one step further, and we'll talk about that in our series in terms of how we consider the weighted average cost of capital in relation to the same equation. But I think what this provides us is, at least, is an easy way to have a quick assessment as to, you know, the stress test of good versus bad debt. So normally, how we would look at this is if our policy was that debt is effective, or we have effective debt or effective leverage capability, whilst we are consistently, and the word is consistently, producing a return on our invested funds, at least towards the minimum of 3 times the average cost of our debt. So that gives us a whole different way of looking at the policy in regards to, do we have the right debt structure or not? Thank you. I hope you had a little bit of insight in terms of considering, a question that sometimes could be a little bit difficult to answer, and hopefully that may provide you with a different way of looking at your business. Thank you. My name is Andre Geen, and we have used Global Financial Bridge in order to have this discussion. Have a great day.